Okay, so let's go with this. Big data. I like big data. Oh, question, sorry.
Just a simple question. Do we have a Twitter handle for our event so I can follow it? You should make one.
Make one.
Hashtag BRIITE2013.
Sounds good.
And then you're recording both the audio and the video?
Mm-hmm.
Awesome.
All right, so we're recording audio and video. SOC does this. When we had one down here, what was it, 2005? How long ago was it? It was beyond memory, but the ability to capture presentations at this institution is just better than any I've seen elsewhere. I mean, even back then, whenever it was, I can recall in the auditorium, I'd give my talk, and I'm taking questions from the audience, and the guy who's done the production comes trotting down the aisle and hands me the DVD of the talk I've just given. And now they give you MP4 on a flash drive as soon as you're done speaking because it's being generated and encoded real time what's going on. It's real. We should all have this, okay? I mean, the goal of science is to communicate, and you communicate in writing, and you communicate by talking and giving presentations. And a lot of us have a lot of support for the writing side and very little support for the communication side, the verbal communication side. Everybody watch and learn what goes on here. Okay, big data. Is it a buzzword or is it actually a big deal, and should we care? Okay, so I'm going to try to make a case. Well, first off, what is big data? And if you search the interwebs to find out what big data is, you find out that it's this punk duo from, okay, so the other big data is this. This is a chart of, it's an estimate, but based on reasonable sources, of how much recorded information there is on Earth in analog, green, and digital form as a function of time. So we go back here in 1986, and we figured there's about 2.6 exabytes of information and 0.2 exabytes of digital data, and then you move forward, and this only goes to 2007, and you see that there's a lot more data available in the world today than there was 20 or 30 years ago, and the ratio of analog to digital has changed profoundly, okay? So something's going on that's real. There's a lot of data, big data. The phrase, the buzzword phrase, was first coined in 2001, which is remarkably prescient if you look at this graph, and it was done in one of these consultant reports by a guy named Doug Laney, and he talks about data volume, data velocity, and data variety. A lot of people still talk about that when they talk about big data. And data volume means there's just more than you can handle with extant systems. It's stressing you, but that's been the nature of computing since the beginning. Velocity is coming at you fast. That also is kind of typical. Variety is important. What variety means is it's coming from a multitude of sources. What Laney meant was it wasn't in necessarily interchange format compatible, but today what it means is that very often people are using information, data collected for one purpose, for wholly other purposes, okay? And that is kind of interesting, the way that goes. Is it a buzzword? Well, if you go to Google and you search on big data, you get 11 million hits. So that's kind of a sign of buzzword status. If you go to Amazon and you search on big data, you find they've got 1,100 books. And so that's kind of a sign that it's getting into buzzword status. And when you can get big data for dummies, you know that it's really arrived, that this is something that everybody needs to know, even if they don't have the capacity to know. If you start looking at magazine covers, you see The Economist, Foreign Affairs, Harvard Business Review, Cosmos. Lots of them have had cover articles about big data, including Nature. Okay? And NIH has the BD2K, Big Data to Knowledge buzzword that's out there. So it's even gone to where it's been acronymized into government speak. All right, we have cartoons. You can open almost any magazine and find cartoons that somehow manage to make a joke out of big data, some that actually have to do with computers and some that are just another old joke recycled. Things like big data is a scary sort of thing to deal with, and the predictive capability of big data is sometimes scary. And of course, Dilbert has to have something to say about big data. And you know you've really arrived as a buzzword when you're in lolcat land. But actually, it turns out that the guys at Comedy Central that do lolcat have just hired a big-time data scientist because big data actually is a big deal. It's important. It has significance in a number of different ways. The first is truly humongous data analysis. And I'll give you an example. What's the most valuable thing that you could ever possibly imagine having, the thing that would guarantee wealth? Okay? It's a subscription to tomorrow's Wall Street Journal. All right? Now, how could you come close to a subscription to tomorrow's Wall Street Journal? Well, maybe trying to do a minute-by-minute covariance analysis of every stock traded in every stock market on Earth along with a whole bunch of news feeds. And if you could do that, you might find predictive trends that would be akin to having a subscription to tomorrow's Wall Street Journal, and it would give you the right to stick a tap in the world's money pipes. Okay? But think about what that analysis would be. If you're trying to do a minute-by-minute covariance analysis of all of those things, you'd better be able to complete a minute's worth of data in less than 60 seconds, right? Because otherwise a minute has passed and there's more data that you haven't gotten around to yet, so you'll just be behind before you start. So truly humongous analyses are one of the challenges for big data. And that's field dependent, so I'm not going to go into a lot of that. But in genomics, we've talked about this before. We're heading into a world where depending on the rate of acceleration of sequencing technology, in 5 or 10 years, we may get to where we can generate data faster on an instrument than we can move it off the instrument on a typical network. And that's going to be a different kind of world. The GenBank model will fail if it takes a month to move on a network data to GenBank, and it only takes 2 weeks to generate it on an instrument. So we've got those kind of things coming. The datafication of reality, that's the idea that lots of things are spewing data now that never used to spew data. And this data spew can turn out to be useful. Like, think about when you fire up Google Maps and the little blue dot shows you where you are and you're moving down the road. With that information, you can calculate your speed. And with that information on every cell phone out there, you can calculate the average speed on any stretch of road, which means you can then produce traffic maps from cell phone data of devices talking to towers and moving. When n equals all, there's a book I'm going to recommend strongly. When you are no longer sampling a set of information, but you have it all, things really change profoundly, both from an analysis point of view and from a policy point of view. And I'm going to flog on this quite a bit here later. Okay, so the datafication of reality. Here's an example. In 1908, a truly big deal happened when this meteor hit Tunguska with the effect of about 10 to 15 megatons. So that's a good-sized hydrogen bomb. That was a major event. And it's about 1,000 times the force of what took out Hiroshima. This is the size of force that was knocked down. There's a scale comparison of Washington, D.C. So it was a big event. If it had happened over a city, folks would have noticed, or if somebody not living in the city would have noticed. But at the time, nobody could get there. It was a long way out. Russia didn't have a lot of resources. It took 20 years for anybody even to go out to the site and see what happened. And the best they could do is get a bunch of pictures of trees knocked down. They'd been down for 20 years, and interview a few people who kind of remembered that there was a bright light and a big noise and shit happened. And okay. So that's about all we had of Tunguska. Now, we had this one earlier this year, Chelyabinsk, okay, which happened, as you see from the map, just down the road from Tunguska. There's something about central Russia that attracts these things. And this one went off with an airburst of about 500 kilotons, which is, gee, only 20 or 30 times Hiroshima. So it was a big deal. It got recorded lots of different times. So you have security cameras showing people getting knocked around in buildings. You have the dash cams that show this thing coming in. You've got somebody catching a picture of the trail going across the sky. Nobody planned this. This is just part of the datafication of the world, that there are so many devices out there recording reality that something completely unexpected like this coming right at you, Hiroshima-sized bomb coming right at you, and you're just driving along, and there it is. Now, you'd think that that'd be kind of exciting, right, to be driving along in your car and see something that could be the end of the dinosaurs coming right at your face. And it might just kind of get you excited. Well, here's a Russian had the camera turned around, and when the light got bright. Okay, so Russians are cool. You can't get them excited. Right when it happened, here's a short news article in Nature about this happening, right after it happened. But like with anything, it takes a while to analyze things, and then papers started to appear. This is one about the Russian skyfall. They've now estimated the size of this thing. Here's a paper in Science, or in Nature, that calculated the trajectory, the structure, and origin of the impactor, and their primary data that they used for this were 15 YouTube videos. okay? Because with all these videos from different directions, with date and timestamps on them, with the georeferencing of the sites in the foreground, the known focal length of the camera probably hidden away in EXIF information or who knows what, they were able to calculate speed, amount of, they did the videos of glass blowing out of windows, and they could calculate what the force would be required to put the glass on that kind of trajectory and how far it was from the event, that sort of thing. So what we find is because of the datafication of reality, here's a paper in Science, that by looking at brightness on YouTube videos calculated the energy release. Okay, so we've got a world in which the datafication of reality is going to turn out to be important for science. All right, now when n equals all, what's the big deal about that? Well, this book I really recommend. If you haven't seen this book, out of 1,100 books out there, 11 million websites, can a new book have something to say? And the answer is yes, I think so. I found this book to be genuinely important. And I'll give you some excerpts from it. But they're saying it's about predictions. And one of the points they make is that if you have n equals all, you no longer have to ask, how am I going to get a good representative sample? You have all. And so you don't have sampling error to deal with. You can now afford more fuzziness in your assessment. And because you have access to all in close to real time, you can also begin to ignore an effort to generate causality and just settle for correlation. You go to Amazon, you buy a book, you look at something on Amazon, and up comes a little thing that says, other people who looked at this object looked at this too. That's pure correlation. It's got nothing to do with causality, but they suspect that people who are interested in this might be interested in that because a lot of other folks were. Last year, my wife had foot surgery, so she was on Amazon looking for crutches. And it comes up with people who are interested in crutches also were interested in this thing. And it's kind of a strap-on peg leg that you strap on and you're on your knee and your foot sticks out the back and you can actually learn how to walk with it. It's strapped onto your thigh. She'd never known it existed, but she looked at it and said, that could be useful. And so she had to not put any weight on a foot for the better part of 2.5 months, and she discovered that crutches, the strap-on peg leg, and one of those scooters, each one of them works well in a different situation. But she never would have found out about the peg leg if it hadn't been for Amazon's purely correlation big data analysis. It said people that look at this sometimes look at that. It can be really useful. Okay.
It's out of stock at Amazon. It's out of
Yeah.
stock at Amazon.
Now, out of stock at Amazon. This is what I like about big data now. You just check on stuff in real time. Okay, cool. And also pointing out that you lose detail. When you sample, you lose detail. The critical thing is, though, when you have n equals all, it's what you want is in there. It's just a matter of finding it. You've also got a whole bunch of dreck that you don't want. Okay, so when n equals all, it's possible to collect data on the objects of interest. Profound change in analytical methods required. Okay, even more profound policy changes begin to arise. Let's explore those. When n equals all, here's an example, OU with Google Glass on. There he is. We got one right here in the room. Everything is recorded. So you got everything you want except privacy. Even The Economist got a little nervous about this a couple issues ago. Now, think about this. Finding a needle in a haystack is hard. That's been the metaphor for centuries of a hard task. Unless you got a big electromagnet, and then it's fall down easy. Boom, ding, there's your needle, plus a bunch of screws and other things that also happen to be in there. But the point is, if it's in there, and you know it's in there, it's just a matter of being clever with your selection regime, and you can find it. Okay? Collecting data about one individual on Earth is hard unless you've got access to multiple big data sets where n equals all, and you know a few things about that individual that are independent and uncommon. Remember that 1,000 times 1,000 times 1,000 is 1 billion, and 100 5 times over is 10 billion. So if I know 5 things about a person that are independent, that occur in 1% of the population at random, I can pick one person out of 10 billion. I can pick one person out of the entire Earth by knowing 5 things about him with a 1 out of 100 probability. And no noise. And no noise. Okay, now here's an example. I'm into photography, and several years ago I saw this on a website, and I thought, that's cool. And Hard Rock Cafe Beijing on the T-shirt. Coast kind of looks like California. I've lived in California. I haven't seen those. So I said, this isn't California. And I had reason to believe at this particular website this wasn't a Photoshop job. But I thought, where the hell is that picture taken? I just wanted to know. And the picture was no identification. It was just a collection of weird weather photos. And I thought, I'd really like to know. Now, how would you go about finding out where the picture was taken? Bingo. Pull the thing down, grab the EXIF data. I got a date. That's all I got was a date. But now I take the date, tornado, or waterspout, shove it into Google, and I find out that it's taken in the Adriatic Sea off the coast of Croatia, and that the photographer has got a Flickr site, he's got a bunch of other pictures taken the same day, and that's the photographer, and his name or his handle is Malden DJ. Time taken to find that out, 5 minutes. Grab the EXIF information and go. Okay, here's a true story. Some time ago, I was on a flight from DC back to Seattle. I met a guy on the plane. I don't normally chat to people on the plane, but this guy was interesting. I didn't get his name. But what I did get was that he did IT consulting for pharmas. He was German. Seattle was his home airport. His consulting company had a name that sounded like process, something like that. He mentioned his first name, like the way I would say. I was talking to Clayton the other day, and he says, Bob, you really got it. So he used his own first name, quoting somebody else, and it sounded like Hakim. What kind of German name is that? But that's what I had. And he knows Tim Jenkins, who's a co-founder of Point B Consultancy in Seattle, and I know Tim Jenkins. And so I figured, hey, a couple of consultants are going to be connected on LinkedIn, and I'm connected to Tim. So I get home and I fire up Tim Jenkins' LinkedIn page, and sure enough, he's got a boatload of contacts, and LinkedIn doesn't make it easy to search those. So I started brute forcing through them 10 at a time, and I found the name Akim Reeb. Hakim, could be the same guy, but now I've got a name. I shoved that in Google, bingo. I got his name, I got his address, I got his company, I got his Photoshop, his Facebook page, I got his wife, his kids, his address, the value of his house when I go to this kind of stuff. So I send him an email and I say, hey, we had a good conversation on the plane last night. I'd like to get together. What do you say we do lunch? He said, great. So we did. And this was several years ago. And the interesting thing is that in preparation for this talk, I went back and retraced my steps, and I clicked on his LinkedIn page, and because he has the professional status on it, he gets advice when anybody clicks on his LinkedIn page. And so while I'm in the process of doing this, Big Data told him I was looking at his LinkedIn page. He sent me another email, we're going to do lunch again soon. So this is interesting. Time elapsed about 30 minutes, and that was the brute force analog going through the list on LinkedIn. Okay, here's another hypothetical story. This one's not quite true, but let's just say I met a guy on a plane, and it came out that he's a CIO, so I shoved CIO into Google, and it came out that he's got a PhD, and his name is Clayton. And, yep, that's him. So 4 clicks, and I've got Clayton. Or I meet another guy on a plane, and he works at NIH and does informatics, name's Warren, and there he is. So the point is that it's not hard to find data about individuals with just a few points that are atypical. Okay. Now, most of you are probably familiar with the fact that this guy at the Whitehead last year de-identified a bunch of people in the 1,000 Genomes Project. And this is who did it, Janov Ehrlich. And you probably can't read this, but the beginning paragraph says, surnames are paternally inherited in most human societies, resulting in their co-segregation with Y chromosome haplotypes. That's the hook. That's the electromagnet. And by the fact that a lot of genealogical sites connect surnames and pedigrees to Y chromosome haplotypes, he goes to perfectly available big data information on the internet and shoves in de-identified sequence data and gets out names, addresses, pedigrees, all bunch of relatives and this kind of stuff. It's easy. This is important. Big data does this. And yet, NIH GWAS policy, soon to be incorporated by reference into the new large-scale genome data sharing policy, requires that institutions and a cognizant official at the institution stipulate that not only has the data been de-identified, but that the data cannot be re-identified even in combination with other information.
But there are no cognizant officials, so we're good.
No, it's just who's willing to claim to be a cognizant official. Here's my take on this combined with the analysis of big data. This is a requirement by NIH that grantee institutions stipulate to a known falsehood in order to receive funding for large-scale genomic sequencing. Okay? Here's a website, a blog at Harvard Law School. Look at this title. Look at this title. Re-identification is not the problem. The delusion of de-identification is. That's in the big frickin' deal category. Okay? The delusion of de-identification. That says that the almost trivial possibilities of re-identifying data that has any kind of descriptive information on it, once you combine it with arbitrary big data, means that we either develop a new approach that recognizes the possibility, indeed likelihood of re-identification, or we give up on data sharing. Okay? This book addresses this, and this is why I think this book is important. They got a whole chapter on what they think are new policies needed to deal with data privacy and data use in the world, given that de-identification is a delusion. And their case mainly is, and these are just excerpts because I like to do this if people want to read the slides later, is that presently we put the onus on the collector of the data to keep it private. We expect the person about whom the data is to give consent. And then, because of that, we don't have to worry about who might use it because they won't be able to get it, right? Because it's been consented and de-identified. But if we assume the delusion of de-identification, that doesn't work. And these guys argue that what we need to do is, let's see where it's, here it is with teeth, that we need to develop policies and laws that deal with the idea that the data will be out there, it will be able to re-identify it, and we put significant civil and criminal penalties on misuse. So instead of putting the burden on people to keep it secret, which is now impossible, we say it's going to be out there. The crime is now not letting it out. The crime is going to be using it for socially defined bad purposes.
That's why Google says don't be evil.
Don't be evil. Yeah, there you go. And again, more excerpts from this kind of stuff. Let's see, the shift in controls from individual consent to data user accountability is a fundamental and essential change necessary for effective big data governance. That's key. That's the world we're in, and we're not there yet. So if it is no longer possible to prevent the misuse of data by enforcing data privacy, and the de-identification is a delusion, you have to make a fundamental shift from the data collectors to the data misusers, and an entirely new set of policies is needed with regard to research and clinical data. Warren, look up. NIH, please take note. I really think that what we're going to need to make something like this happen is something like an NIH and maybe National Academy of Medicine co-sponsored NRC study that really looks at this and says, on the assumption that de-identification is genuinely delusional, how do we continue to do biomedical research when we can take anything, any bit of demographic data that you need to interpret clinical data and now re-identify from it? How are we going to function in that kind of world?
So the IOM has a working group in February on what does consent mean in today's world.
Right.
This is a topic.
Right, and it's even beyond consent. So conclusion is, yep, big data is a big deal, and here's more proof. I don't know how this guy does it. He just hits things point after point. I know when I was a manager, I used to just wince every time I'd read Dilbert, and the pointy-haired guy would say something that I just said in a staff meeting. It was like, oh, how did that happen? Anyway, welcome to BRIITE. That's my talk. Thanks.